There's a strange pressure that descends on you somewhere between 18 and 29. It's the pressure of becoming, the pressure of figuring out who you're supposed to be while everyone around you seems to have already arrived at their destination. You're supposed to have a plan, a direction, a sense of purpose that feels solid and certain, but here you are, standing in the middle of your 20s, feeling completely broken. And it's not the kind of broken you can put into words easily. It's not like a physical injury where you can point to something and say, this is what hurts. Drad. Instead, it's a fragmentation that lives inside you. A feeling that somewhere along the way you missed the instruction manual on how to be a proper adult. That everyone else got the blueprint, but yours got lost in translation. See, your 20s are sold to you as the best years of your life. Freedom, possibility, adventure, the world at your feet, but what they don't tell you is that possibility can feel paralyzing. Freedom can feel like drowning. And a world full of infinite choices can make you feel like you've already failed before you even began. Because with so many paths available, how do you know if you're choosing the right one? How do you know if you're broken for not knowing? There's a concept in psychology called emerging adulthood. It describes the period from roughly 18 to 29 as a time of identity exploration, instability, and self-focus. But that clinical definition doesn't capture what it really feels like. It doesn't capture the panic that rises in your chest at 3 in the morning when you realize you don't have your life figured out. It doesn't explain the crushing weight of expectation that seems to come from everywhere at once. Your parents expect you to be building something. Your peers seem to be getting promotions, buying houses, settling down. Social media shows you curated versions of everyone's success. And you're sitting there, feeling like you're falling behind a race you never agreed to run. The comparison is relentless. The self-doubt is suffocating. And somewhere in all of this, you start to believe that maybe there's something fundamentally wrong with you. This feeling of being broken in your 20s is more common than you might think. In fact, it's almost universal. Therapists and psychologists see it constantly. Young people walking into their offices, carrying this invisible weight, this sense that they've somehow failed at the basic task of becoming an adult. But here's what's important to understand. What feels like brokenness is often just the natural friction of growth. Your brain is still developing at this age. The part of your brain responsible for decision-making, the prefrontal cortex, doesn't fully mature until your mid-20s. So the indecision you feel, the impulsive choices, the moments where you don't know what you want, that's not a personal failing, that's neurology. You're literally in a stage of development where uncertainty is built into your biology. But knowing that intellectually doesn't make the feeling go away, you still feel broken. You still wake up some mornings with this existential dread, this sense that everyone else has figured out the secret and you've been left behind. You compare your behind the scenes to everyone else's highlight reel. You see people your age who seem so put together, so directed, so sure of themselves, and you wonder what's wrong with you that you're not like that. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with feeling broken in your 20s. It's not the loneliness of being alone. It's the loneliness of feeling disconnected from the world around you, even when you're surrounded by people. Because everyone seems to be performing competence, and you're over here drowning in your own confusion. It's hard to reach out because admitting that you're struggling feels like admitting defeat, and there's shame attached to it. Deep, persistent shame, because your 20s are supposed to be easy, right? You're young, you have your whole life ahead of you, you should be thriving. So when you're not thriving, when you're actually falling apart, the shame compounds everything. You feel broken for feeling broken. You judge yourself for not being able to just pull yourself together and get it right. But here's something psychologists have discovered. The people who feel most broken in their 20s are often the people thinking most deeply about their lives. They're not broken, they're just aware. They've noticed that something's not adding up. They've realized that the plan everyone told them to follow doesn't fit who they actually are. And that awareness, while painful, is actually the beginning of real growth. Your 20s are a time of identity crisis, and that's not a bug, it's a feature. It's the time when you're supposed to question everything. Who am I? What do I actually want? What matters to me? What kind of person do I want to become? These aren't questions you're failing at. These are questions you're supposed to be asking. And the discomfort you feel is the friction of figuring it out. Think about it this way. A caterpillar doesn't become a butterfly by staying a caterpillar. It has to break down completely inside the cocoon. It has to become liquefied, broken down into its basic components before it can emerge as something entirely new. And during that process, if the caterpillar could think, it would probably feel broken too. But that breaking apart is essential. Without it, the butterfly never forms. The feeling of brokenness in your 20s often comes from a mismatch between expectations and reality. Somewhere along the way, you were told who you should be, what you should achieve, what timeline you should follow. Maybe your parents had expectations. Maybe you absorbed messages from society about what success looks like. Maybe you compared yourself to people who seemed to have it all figured out from the start. And now you're realizing that the person you're supposed to be and the person you actually are might be two very different things. This realization is destabilizing. It feels like the ground beneath you has disappeared, and that's because in some sense it has. You're no longer operating under the assumption that if you follow the rules, everything will work out. You're starting to see that life is more complicated than that there's no one right path, that you have to figure out what matters to you, and that's terrifying because it means you have to take responsibility for your own life. But it's also liberating, even if you can't feel that yet. There's a psychological phenomenon called a quarter-life crisis, and it's not actually a crisis in the traditional sense. It's a transition. It's a moment when you realize that the life you thought you were going to have might not be the life you actually want, or that the person you thought you were supposed to be isn't who you actually are. And that realization feels like everything is falling apart because in a way it is. The identity you've been building is being questioned, the plans you made are being reconsidered, the version of yourself you thought was set in stone is being melted down. What makes this feel like brokenness is that we're not taught how to handle it. We're not given a framework for understanding that falling apart is sometimes part of the process of coming together in a better way. Instead, we're told to have it all figured out, to be motivated, ambitious, sure of ourselves. And when we're not those things, we assume there's something wrong with us individually, rather than understanding that what we're going through is actually a normal, healthy part of human development. Your 20s are when you start to really understand yourself. Not the version of yourself that was constructed to please your parents or fit in with your peers, but the actual you underneath all of that. And sometimes that actual you is very different from the person you thought you were. That person might have different values, different dreams, different ways of moving through the world. Meeting that person, really meeting them, can feel like a kind of death, the death of who you thought you were supposed to be. And grief is a part of feeling broken. Real genuine grief for the life you thought you were going to have. The version of yourself you imagined. The timeline you expected to follow. There's loss in that, and loss requires grieving. You have to mourn the person you thought you'd be before you can become the person you're actually becoming. That process is not comfortable, but it's necessary. In your 20s, you're also developing what psychologists call your sense of agency. This is your belief that you have control over your own life, that your actions matter, that you can influence your own future. And agency is not something you either have or don't have. It's something that develops gradually, often through trial and error, through failure, through experiences where you try something and it doesn't work out, and you have to figure out what to do next, providates inquisitive. But in a culture obsessed with success and achievement, we don't talk about failure as a teacher, we talk about it as a judgment on who we are. So when you fail, when things don't work out the way you planned, when you make mistakes, it feels like evidence that you're broken, that you're not good enough. And you absorb that belief. You start to see your failures not as data points in your ongoing development, but as proof that something fundamental is wrong with you. The feeling of being broken in your 20s is also connected to something psychologists call the imposter syndrome. This is the persistent belief that you're not as competent as others perceive you to be, that any success you've had is due to luck or deception rather than actual ability, that sooner or later everyone's going to figure out that you don't actually know what you're doing, and you're going to be exposed as a fraud. And here's the thing about imposter syndrome. It doesn't correlate with actual competence. Some of the most accomplished people experience it intensely, because in your 20s you're likely at the beginning of something. A career, a creative pursuit, a relationship, whatever it is. And when you're at the beginning, you don't have the experience yet that would make you feel competent. You're surrounded by people who've been doing it longer, and it's easy to assume that their competence is evidence of something you lack. But what you might not realize is that everyone else feels the same way. The person who seems so confident in your class, they're terrified too. The person who got the internship you wanted, they're questioning whether they deserve it. The person whose life seems so perfectly on track, they're falling apart behind closed doors. We're all just pretending we know what we're doing, hoping no one figures out that we're all just making it up as we go along. Feeling broken in your 20s can also come from what's called the hedonic treadmill. This is the human tendency to return to a baseline level of happiness regardless of what happens in your life. You get the promotion you always wanted, and for a while you feel great, but then you adjust to it, and the happiness fades. You achieve the goal you spent years working toward, and it doesn't feel as good as you thought it would. And you're left wondering why nothing ever feels quite right, why you never feel quite satisfied with where you are. This can make your 20s feel like a perpetual state of dissatisfaction. You're always chasing the next thing, always thinking that happiness is somewhere else, somewhere you haven't arrived yet. And that perpetual striving, combined with the knowledge that you're not where you thought you'd be by now, creates this deep sense of being broken. Like you're broken because you can't stay satisfied, like you're broken because the things that are supposed to make you happy don't feel like enough. But the truth is, this isn't brokenness. This is just how human motivation works. We're built to pursue things, to seek, to strive. The hedonic treadmill isn't a flaw in you, it's a feature of human psychology, and understanding that can be surprisingly freeing. Because once you realize that no external achievement is ever going to make you feel completely satisfied, you can stop waiting for that feeling and start building a life that feels meaningful now, in the present moment, not as a means to some future happiness. There's also a very real component of social and economic pressure that makes your 20s feel like such a minefield. You're entering the job market at a time of economic uncertainty. The cost of housing, education, and healthcare have skyrocketed. The promise that if you work hard you'll be able to build a stable life doesn't feel true anymore. You're competing with more people than ever before for jobs that often pay less than previous generations earned in similar positions. And that's not a personal failing on your part. That's not brokenness. That's structural. That's economic. But it can feel deeply personal when you're living it. When you're watching your peers struggle with student debt, when you can't afford to move out, when the timeline you were given for adulthood isn't matching up with the reality of the world you're actually living in, it's easy to blame yourself, to feel like you're broken because you're not succeeding in the way you're supposed to. But your 20s are not the end of the story. This is where a lot of people get stuck in their feeling of brokenness. They think that if they haven't figured it out by 25 or 27 or 29, then they've somehow fallen irredeemably behind. But the truth is, some of the most important developments in human life happen later. Some people don't find their career until their 30s or 40s. Some people don't understand themselves until much later. Some people don't meet the person they're going to spend their life with until they thought it was too late. Your 20s are not a dress rehearsal for your real life. They're your real life happening right now, in all its mess and confusion and uncertainty. The broken feelings you're having are not proof that you've failed. They're proof that you're awake, that you're questioning, that you're developing, that you're becoming. In fact, if you're feeling broken in your 20s, you're probably doing something right. You're not blindly accepting the path that was laid out for you. You're not just going through the motions. You're actually thinking about your life. You're actually wondering if this is what you want. You're actually trying to figure out who you are. And yes, that's uncomfortable. Yes, that's painful. But it's also exactly what you're supposed to be doing. The psychology of feeling broken in your 20s is really the psychology of growth. It's the discomfort of outgrowing your old self. It's the confusion of not yet knowing who your new self is going to be. It's the grief of letting go and the fear of what comes next. But it's also, if you can learn to see it this way, the beginning of something real. Because the people who feel the deepest brokenness in their 20s are often the people who end up building the most meaningful lives. They're the ones who didn't just accept the default path. They're the ones who questioned everything. They're the ones who were willing to fall apart so they could come back together in a way that actually fit who they were. And that takes courage. That takes resilience. That takes a kind of strength that doesn't look like strength in the moment, but looks a lot like falling apart. So if you're in your 20s and you feel broken, know this: you're not broken. You're becoming. You're in the cocoon. You're in the dark, uncertain space where you don't yet know what you're going to be. But something is happening. Something is shifting. Something is growing. And one day, when you look back on this time, you might realize that the brokenness was actually the beginning of wholeness. That the confusion was actually clarity. That the falling apart was actually the only way you knew how to put yourself back together in a way that was true.